I'm Eliza Coleman, 30, and I'm a successful esthetician. I walked into the courtroom, ready to defend myself against my own parents. The marble was cold, the silence heavy. My mother, Karen, shot me a look of pure, unadulterated contempt, then dramatically rolled her eyes. It was her signature move, complete, theatrical dismissal of my entire existence. That look said, "How dare you fight us?" The judge began reading the docket. Then, he stopped. He looked at me, then back at the file, then back at me. His brow furrowed with pure astonishment. Judge Miller, a colleague of my grandfather's, leaned into the microphone and said, "Wait. These allegations of fraud are against you?" The room froze. That's when the real game began. Why did a respected judge who knew my family seem so shocked by the name on the lawsuit? To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning. To understand the courtroom shock, you need the backstory. My biological parents, Karen and David, were young, ambitious, and utterly unready for a child. They decided to pursue their higher calling in business, which meant I was a distraction. So, at 6 months old, I was quietly handed over to the only stability I'd ever know, my maternal grandparents, Judge Robert Vance and his wife, Helen. I was an inconvenient truth they outsourced. The story of my life begins with a handover, not a hug. My grandparents were pillars of integrity. Grandpa Vance, the judge, was my mentor in justice and logic. Grandma Helen was my anchor in empathy and grace. They didn't just raise me, they invested their entire legacy into making sure I knew my self-worth was non-negotiable. Their home was a sanctuary, a stark contrast to the transactional world Karen and David lived in. They gave me the foundation my parents chose to forego. But how did this loving upbringing lead to a devastating courtroom battle years later? I channeled my grandparents' lessons, precision, meticulous care, and a devotion to truth, into my career. I became a successful esthetician, not by chasing trends, but by valuing integrity. My grandfather taught me that justice is just as vital in a consultation room as it is in a courtroom. I refused to sell expensive, unnecessary treatments. My reputation was built on honesty, not exaggeration. My clients trusted me completely. By my late 20s, I opened my own high-end studio. It was financed by years of hard work, not a family handout. Every dollar earned was a direct reflection of my effort, free from any familial conditions or leverage. This business was my proof of concept. I could thrive entirely on my own merit. Success gave me confidence, but it didn't erase the deep-seated fear of rejection my parents instilled. I built my fences high and kept my life intensely private. My independence was hard-won, and I was fiercely protective of it. But even in my sanctuary, their shadow was waiting for the right moment to strike. What exactly were those rare, hostile visits like? Karen and David kept up the bare minimum of parental obligation, a 2-hour visit, twice a year, usually around a major holiday. These weren't joyous reunions, they were forced performances. They'd show up in their expensive clothes, assessing me like a piece of questionable property. Their presence felt like an audit, a highly critical review of my grades, my manners, and my potential inheritance. I learned to brace myself for their arrival. Their favorite pastime was criticizing the way my grandparents raised me, often using me as the silent prop in their parental drama. "Robert, she's too quiet. She needs a competitive edge." Karen would scoff. "She doesn't have our flair for business, David." I was not a daughter, I was a project that lacked the necessary flair to be worthy of them. The emotional sting was sharp. But why was my passion for aesthetics a specific target of Karen's scorn? The rare times they asked about my future, they expected an answer involving law or corporate finance. When I enthusiastically shared my plan to study advanced skincare, Karen's fork clattered dramatically. "Skincare? Eliza, darling, we are the Colemans. We create capital, we don't apply moisturizers. That is frivolous, low-end work. Her words were precise, designed to cut. It wasn't just a dismissal of the job, it was a rejection of my character. They defined value only by financial scale. What Karen called frivolous, I called craft. While they were building a shaky empire on speculation, I was perfecting a skill based on real science and dedicated practice. They measured success in transactions. I measured it in trust and transformation. They failed to see the diligence in aesthetics. David, my father, was always conspicuously silent during these episodes. He never defended me, but he also never fully engaged. He retreated into his own shame, avoiding eye contact. His silence was its own form of rejection, a passive confirmation of Karen's venom. That absence of support was almost worse than her open hostility. What was the root of David's deep, paralyzing shame? My father, David, rarely spoke to me directly. His visits were a masterclass in avoidance. I'd sometimes catch him watching me from a distance, a fleeting look of deep, paralyzing shame in his eyes, before he quickly retreated. He wasn't avoiding me, the child, he was avoiding the mirror I held up to his failure. His father-in-law, Judge Vance, had made it painfully clear that David's early abandonment was an act of profound irresponsibility. His guilt was a physical barrier. David's life was dictated by the need to prove Judge Vance wrong, to prove he was a successful businessman, not a failed father. His need for external validation was enormous. He knew, deep down, that the comfort I found with my grandparents was a direct indictment of his and Karen's choices. He carried the shame of the past, and I was the constant, living proof of it. It was easier for him to ignore me entirely. How did these toxic dynamics shape every holiday we spent together? Holidays should have been simple, but they became an emotional tug-of-war. On one side, Grandpa Vance would loudly praise my latest achievement in school, while Grandma Helen wrapped me in unconditional love. On the other, Karen and David sat stone-faced, whispering pointed comments. It was love under a spotlight versus disdain in the shadows. I was constantly calculating my movements, trying to balance the joy of my grandparents with the avoidance of my parents' scrutiny. The air was always thick with unsaid judgment. Even the gifts were symbolic. My grandparents gave me thoughtfully chosen books, art supplies, or something tied to my passions. Karen and David gave me bonds, stock certificates, or just a heavy envelope of cash. Their gifts weren't gestures of affection, they were metrics. They were investments meant to ensure I fulfilled their vision of a profitable heir. The lack of personal connection in their generosity was profoundly isolating. I learned early that their love was conditional, based on ROI. The only reason these visits didn't shatter me was my grandfather's unwavering defense. He was a force of nature, a man of unshakable justice, even against his own daughter. He'd cut Karen off mid-critique. Karen, Eliza is thriving. Her value is internal. He taught me that true wealth is not the inheritance you receive, but the character you build. This was the armor I carried into the world. But how did that self-built character prepare me for the fight of a lifetime? After years of pushing through their scorn, my esthetician studio became my ultimate refuge. It was a space where I controlled the value, the integrity, and the outcome. Every successful client, every positive review, was a direct, irrefutable contradiction to Karen's belief that my work was frivolous. I wasn't chasing transactions, I was providing real service. The confidence this self-made success provided was the armor I desperately needed. I had built a life they could not control. Peace, for me, was the absence of their leverage. I paid my own rent, my own taxes, and my own bills. This financial independence was my greatest boundary. When you don't need anything from your abusers, not money, not approval, not love, you are truly free. My quiet competence was the loudest, most effective form of defiance. Their chaotic world of chasing status and debt meant nothing here. I was finally the architect of my own destiny. I had successfully neutralized the threat of my parents by simply becoming irrelevant to their financial structure. I thought I was safe. I thought my independence was enough. But sometimes, when you build a stable life, a single catastrophic event can upend everything. That event came in the form of a devastating call from my grandmother. What was the life-altering news that ripped my world apart? The devastating call was the news of my grandfather's death. The grief was paralyzing. He was the anchor of my world, the man who taught me everything about justice, honor, and true accountability. His loss was a void that Karen and David's presence at the funeral only made colder. They showed up, not to mourn a father, but to subtly gauge the value of the estate. Their eyes were already on the prize, not the man. The greed was thick enough to cut. A week later, in the lawyer's office, the bombshell dropped. Judge Vance's will was crystal clear. After providing for Helen, the remaining bulk of his estate, including the trust funds and the main residence, was bequeathed solely to me. The lawyer read the clause aloud, to my devoted granddaughter, Eliza Coleman, who honored my legacy. Karen and David were mentioned only with a minimal, non-contestable stipend. The silence was deafening. This wasn't about money, it was his final, powerful verdict. It validated every moment they had dismissed me. He used his last legal act to affirm that love and integrity, not blood, define true family. But why were Karen and David expecting so much more? Karen and David looked smug, ready to dismiss the minimal stipend as an insult. Then, the lawyer presented the financial ledger. He detailed a consistent, bi-monthly transfer of $3,000 from Judge Vance to Karen's personal account, stretching back 20 years. Karen turned instantly pale. This wasn't just money, it was evidence of their ongoing, secret financial dependency. The true irony of the situation was finally coming into sharp focus. They were the beneficiaries, not the victims. This money wasn't for me, their child, it was a silent payoff to them, the parents. My grandfather had literally paid them to stay away and leave me in peace. He was funding their ambitious lifestyle while simultaneously protecting me from their toxicity. $3,000 a month, the price tag for their parental neglect, was staring them in the face. It provided instant clarity. Their grand titles and business flair were propped up by the man they now claimed I manipulated. Karen's smugness evaporated into cold fury. This is a gift. An allowance. Karen spat, trying to salvage her dignity. But the line between a gift and a sustained payment to keep someone quiet is thin, especially when that someone is a grown adult supposedly running a successful business. Her attempt to minimize the transaction only amplified the truth. They were financially dependent children, dressed up as high-flying executives. The walls of their facade were cracking. David didn't even try to defend himself. His deep, paralyzing shame from the holidays was now publicly justified. He sat there, a portrait of defeat. His whole pretense of entrepreneurial success was exposed as a carefully funded lie. He wasn't ashamed of me, he was ashamed of himself, and now everyone in the room knew why he'd always avoided my eyes. Their claim of undue influence was a joke. This evidence was a gift from my grandfather. It was his final, silent lesson: never let those who depend on you claim they're fighting for you. The truth was on the ledger, not in their lawsuit. The lawyer finished, but the meeting was far from over. Their initial shock quickly turned into a monstrous, entitled fury. They saw the money slip away and their pride collapse. Karen looked at me, her eyes burning with pure, irrational hatred. "You manipulated that old man. You stole from us," she screamed. The stage was set. How did I respond when faced with their most devastating accusation? The composure that Karen usually maintained for public consumption shattered. She wasn't just angry, she was consumed by a monstrous, entitled fury that only comes when privilege is threatened. "You manipulative little esthetician. You think your little lotions and potions made you worthy? Her voice was venom, thick and uncontrolled. You preyed on an old man's sentimentality. You convinced him we abandoned you, when he was the one paying us off. Their guilt became my crime. Even David, the master of avoidance, finally spoke. His voice was hoarse with desperation. You were always the favorite. We made sacrifices for you, Eliza, and you stole our inheritance. You abused his trust. You replaced us. This wasn't just about the money. It was the ultimate narcissistic injury. They couldn't face the fact that they were replaceable, and that their father/father-in-law had chosen me. Their pain wasn't mine to fix. The sheer volume of their accusations was an emotional tsunami. They didn't see me, they saw a barrier standing between them and a multi-million-dollar estate. Every word they screamed was a projection of their own failure and greed. I felt a sharp, cutting sense of heartbreak, not because they hurt my feelings, but because they were incapable of mourning the man who had supported them for 2 decades. They only grieved the lost source of income. My years of training under Judge Vance kicked in. I stopped hearing their words as emotional attacks and started analyzing them as legal strategy. Undue influence, that was their only card. They had zero evidence of manipulation, only the evidence of their own neglect and financial dependence. I took a deep breath, recognizing that I was now dealing with adversaries, not parents. I saw the battle clearly laid out before me. The lawyer finally intervened, cutting their tirade short. Mr. and Ms. Coleman, I suggest you retain counsel. Any further outbursts will be noted. They had hit their lowest point, yet they doubled down. They chose to fight, not to reconcile. Their final accusation hung in the air, that I was an undue influence. It was the perfect moment for me to finally use my voice, to deploy the logic and integrity my grandfather had taught me. I looked straight at Karen, the architect of my rejection, and delivered my truth. What was the one single sentence that stopped their rage cold and set the tone for the entire legal war? Karen's rage was a wild animal, David's shame was a wound. They waited for me to cry, to apologize, to back down. But I felt a crystalline clarity. The fear they had instilled over 20 years was replaced by a surge of righteous indignation. I spoke, my voice low and steady, a deliberate contrast to their screaming, "You accuse me of undue influence?" I simply fulfilled the role you consciously chose to vacate. The air crackled with suppressed hostility. I let the truth hit them. He saw my dedication, my integrity, and my love. He invested in me because I showed up. You only showed up with a checkbook in mind. Then came the sentence that became the title of this war, delivered with the absolute conviction my grandfather had taught me. He raised me. You didn't. The room went silent. I hadn't just rejected their claim, I had legally and emotionally revoked their parenthood. The venom in Karen's eyes intensified. Karen couldn't tolerate the public shame. The next day, she and David officially filed a lawsuit to contest the will, citing fraud, undue influence, and mental incapacity on my grandfather's part. They were determined to dismantle his final legacy and strip me of everything. Their goal was simple: destroy my life to preserve their toxic pride and bank account. The gloves were off. It was war. I knew I couldn't afford to lose. My goal shifted from securing an inheritance to defending my grandfather's honor and my grandmother's security. I worked with my lawyers tirelessly, compiling every email, every bank record, and every witness statement that proved the Vances were my actual parents. We prepared to use Karen and David's own 20-year history of neglect as the primary evidence against them. Justice was the only currency that mattered. Despite my strength, there were moments of crushing vulnerability. The thought of being publicly humiliated by the 2 people who gave me life was terrifying. It wasn't just a legal case, it was a public dissection of my abandonment. I leaned on Grandma Helen, who reminded me, "Your grandfather taught you integrity. Now, show them what justice truly looks like." Her faith anchored me. The courtroom became my final stage. And that brings us back to the courtroom, to the moment Karen rolled her eyes, convinced I was a nobody destined to fail. She didn't realize that the very place where my grandfather had sought justice would be the stage for her downfall. I wasn't just defending a will, I was enacting a life's worth of justice. The verdict would be more than just money. Karen looked at me with contempt, but Judge Miller saw my name and paused. He recognized the irony of the entire situation. Did their entitlement overcome the cold, hard evidence? The courtroom was packed. Karen and David's lawyer, a slick operator, stood up and painted a masterpiece of deceit. He claimed I, the self-serving esthetician, had isolated the judge in his frail final years, preying on his affection. Their central claim? Undue influence. It was the ultimate irony. The two people who were literally paid to stay away were now claiming I was too close. Their audacity was truly breathtaking. Their lawyer painted my career, the foundation of my independence, as evidence of my low character and opportunistic nature. The implication was clear: a mere esthetician could not possibly be worthy of a judge's legacy. They were attacking my self-made success to diminish my emotional bond with Grandpa Vance. Karen nodded along, relishing every moment of my public humiliation. It wasn't a legal fight, it was character assassination. I kept my focus on Judge Miller, the man who had known my grandfather for decades. He listened patiently, but I saw the subtle shift in his expression when Karen's lawyer omitted any mention of the 20 years of $3,000 monthly payments. The judge knew the real context of their relationship. That initial flash of recognition was a crucial advantage I was about to exploit. He was ready for the truth. My lawyer stood up, ready to present our counter-narrative. I reminded him to use the language Grandpa Vance taught me: precise, moral, and utterly ruthless in its pursuit of justice. Our strategy was simple: turn their claim of undue influence on its head by proving they were the ones who had leveraged my grandfather's guilt and then abandoned the very child they claimed to protect. We would weaponize their neglect. Your Honor, my lawyer began, we will demonstrate that the plaintiff's relationship with the deceased was not one of familial care, but a 20-year financial transaction. He then introduced the bank records, the hard, cold proof of the $720,000 my grandfather paid them over 2 decades. Karen's face dropped. The courtroom's atmosphere instantly changed from judgment of me to judgment of them. The truth was undeniable. The lawyer continued to build the case, using Karen's own condescending emails about my career as evidence of her disdain. But the key moment was when Judge Miller leaned forward, looking directly at the plaintiffs. He was about to ask the question that would seal their fate. What did Judge Miller ask that forced Karen to publicly reveal their darkest secret? Mr. Davies was surgical. He didn't focus on the will, he focused on the character of the plaintiff. He started with the $3,000 monthly transfers. Karen, brimming with her usual arrogance, dismissed them as nominal parental support, a small token from a wealthy father. She failed to see that by minimizing the funds, she was maximizing her 20-year abandonment of me. Her overconfidence was her weakness. Davies then introduced Karen's emails to her friends, where she mocked my frivolous career choice. Karen had to read the words aloud: "My daughter is wasting her inheritance on applying moisturizer." The arrogance of her dismissal, read in the cold, professional atmosphere of the courtroom, was devastating. Her contempt for my work became undeniable evidence of her contempt for me. The silence was crushing. Judge Miller finally intervened, his voice slow and authoritative. He pointed to the bank ledgers. "Miss Coleman," he addressed Karen, "do you believe a father would need to pay his daughter $3,000 a month for 20 years if they had a loving, present relationship?" It was the question of the trial. Karen stammered, trapped. Her attempt to justify the payments as business loans fell completely flat. The truth was legally binding. Throughout Karen's dramatic unraveling, I remained perfectly calm. I was a student of my grandfather's integrity. He had prepared me for this moment, not with money, but with resilience. I knew my composure was my greatest weapon against their emotional theatrics. I wasn't the one manipulating the court, they were simply proving my grandfather's wisdom in protecting me. Their fury fueled my resolve. Mr. Davies called David to the stand and asked him one question. Mr. Coleman, did you financially support your daughter, Eliza, at any time between her 4th and 24th birthdays? David whispered his reply, but the mic picked it up, no. His carefully constructed image of a successful businessman collapsed. Publicly exposed as a passive beneficiary of his father-in-law's silence money. His silence was his final undoing. Mr. Davies concluded, the plaintiffs claim undue influence. Your Honor, the only influence demonstrated here is the influence of money over morality. They sold their parental rights for $3,000 a month. The case was closed. Judge Miller retired to deliberate, but his final expression spoke volumes. What was the judge's verdict, and what was Karen and David's final, desperate attempt to reclaim their lost fortune? The courtroom was silent, the tension was a physical weight. Judge Miller held the verdict, but he didn't read it. He looked up, bypassing Karen and David's smug, expectant faces, and met my eyes. He paused, a long, pregnant moment that seemed to stretch the fabric of time. I realized he wasn't just reviewing the facts of the case, he was reviewing the history of my life, the life my grandfather had saved. His gaze held both sympathy and respect. He leaned forward slightly. Miss Coleman, he addressed me, using my name with a quiet dignity my parents had never afforded me. I recall your grandfather bringing you to my chambers as a young girl. He was immensely proud of your intellect and your sense of justice. He often spoke of you as his true protégé. The revelation hung in the air. The judge didn't just know the case, he knew me, through the eyes of the man they claimed I had manipulated. Karen's jaw dropped. Judge Miller cleared his throat. The court finds the plaintiff's claim of undue influence to be entirely without merit. He then articulated the facts, the bank records, the abandonment, and the profound difference between familial obligation and transactional distance. He stated that Judge Vance's final act was not one of weakness, but an affirmation of his deeply held moral code. The hammer was about to fall. The testimony and evidence clearly demonstrate that Ms. Eliza Coleman provided the support, affection, and loyalty that the deceased's daughter and son-in-law failed to offer. The notion that the deceased, a man of profound legal acumen, was somehow manipulated by the defendant is wholly contradicted by the plaintiff's own long-standing financial dependency. The will of Judge Vance is upheld. A total, public victory. Karen let out a choked cry, her face a mask of shock and hatred. This is a disgrace. A fix. You're letting that girl steal my father's money. David pulled her back, his face white with terror. Their defeat was not just legal, it was public, personal, and absolute. They had gambled their last shred of dignity on greed and lost everything, their money, their reputation, and any claim to moral superiority. Justice was served cold. I didn't cheer, I didn't smile. I simply nodded to Judge Miller, an acknowledgement that the integrity my grandfather taught me had prevailed. The money was merely a tool. The real victory was the official, legal validation of my self-worth and the public exposure of my parents' conditional love. My revenge was complete, served in the highest court of the land. But what happened to Karen and David next? After establishing their financial dependency, Mr. Davies moved to the core of their undue influence claim, my childhood. He presented a timeline of key dates, birthdays, graduations, and holidays. Next to each event, he displayed 2 columns, Karen/David attendance and Vance attendance. The column for my parents was almost entirely blank, save for the occasional, mandatory Christmas visit. The visual evidence of neglect was stunning. Your Honor, on the defendant's 16th birthday, a commonly celebrated milestone, Karen and David Coleman were in Dubai, on a business trip, paid for by Judge Vance. Davy's voice was measured. Her high school graduation? Absent. Her college acceptance? A perfunctory email. Every major life event was a testament to the prioritization of their image and the convenience of their monthly payments. Karen fidgeted, avoiding the judge's eye. Davies then presented call logs from my final year of high school. These logs show that during a 6-month period when the defendant was preparing for college applications, she called her mother 42 times. The total number of return calls from Karen Coleman? 0. Judge Vance, however, called her 87 times during the same period to discuss her essays and scholarships. A parent's 0 contrasted with a grandfather's 87. Judge Miller spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Mr. Davies, it appears that the deceased was not unduly influenced by the defendant, but rather, he was the sole remaining source of genuine parental affection. He looked at Karen and David with evident disappointment. The evidence suggests the deceased simply chose to leave his estate to the only person who offered him unconditional love. That was the final blow to their character. Karen lunged forward, nearly knocking over her own lawyer. Those dates are irrelevant. We were funding her private education. We gave her everything, she yelled. Davies calmly countered by presenting the tuition payment receipts. All signed by Judge Vance. The denial was so desperate, so baseless, that it utterly destroyed her credibility in the eyes of the court. She had no more lies left. David did what I never expected. He finally cracked. He stood, shaking, and spoke to Judge Miller, ignoring Karen's frantic gestures. We were too focused on our careers. We assumed he had it covered. We traded time for money. It was a micro-confession, a momentary crack of remorse, but it was enough. It validated my entire childhood experience. The truth was finally spoken aloud. As the final exhibit, Davies presented a sealed letter from Grandpa Vance, written a week before his death. In it, he simply wrote, "The loyalty I sought was given freely. The loyalty I paid for was never earned." It was his final, devastating summary of the situation. It wasn't just a legal document, it was a character reference for both sides. The pen was mightier than the sword. Their claim of undue influence had backfired spectacularly. I hadn't influenced him with money or deceit, I had influenced him with presence, respect, and love, the only influence they didn't know how to buy. They stood convicted, not by the court's ruling, but by their own 20 years of indifference. I was vindicated, legally and morally. The silence was deafening. Judge Miller dismissed the case. As he left the bench, he looked at me and gave a subtle, professional nod, a silent message of respect. It wasn't just a win for me, it was a final, posthumous victory for Grandpa Vance. He had ensured his granddaughter had the resources and the legal certainty to never need her toxic parents again. The chapter of their power was closed. Karen and David stormed out, their faces contorted with pure, unadulterated loss. They were broke, disgraced, and utterly defeated. I walked out into the sunshine, finally free. But my story doesn't end with a court ruling. This entire legal confrontation served as the ultimate platform for my justice. I didn't need to yell, the documents spoke for me. The court transcript became the definitive record of my parents' true nature. Every accusation they threw at me bounced back, hitting them with the force of 2 decades of neglect. They had sought to strip me of my legacy, but instead, they stripped themselves of every ounce of public respect. They left the courtroom as social pariahs, their business reputation irrevocably damaged by the public display of their mercenary attitude. The irony was so beautiful. The truth, as Grandpa Vance always taught, is the strongest legal weapon. What was the final act of justice I carried out, and how did I ensure Karen and David never recovered from their own greed? The words echoed with the finality of a gavel strike. The will of Judge Vance is upheld in its entirety. The claims of undue influence are dismissed. It was more than a legal victory, it was the ultimate, official validation that my grandfather had acted with clarity, wisdom, and justified affection. Karen and David's attempt to paint me as a manipulator had only served to publicly sanctify my bond with him. Their scheme was demolished. Karen looked as if she'd been physically struck. Her face, usually so composed and judgmental, dissolved into a mask of pure, visceral hatred. David, the perennial passive participant, simply turned ash white. They didn't grieve the loss of a father or the ruin of a relationship. They grieved the loss of millions. Their lies, printed in the court transcript and seen by the public, were now undeniable facts. They were officially disgraced. I nodded my thanks to my lawyer, stood up, and walked out without a word or a glance back. The air outside the courtroom felt lighter, cleaner. The legal chapter was closed. I was finally free from their conditional approval, their financial influence, and their moral corruption. But my final move wasn't about money. What did I do with my newfound legacy that ensured Karen and David faced the ultimate consequence of their toxic greed? The dust had settled on the court case, but not on the relationship. A few weeks later, my phone pinged. It was Karen. The message was saccharine and totally fake. "We should talk, dear. Family is everything." I knew this wasn't reconciliation, it was a desperate attempt to salvage something, anything. I chose a public, neutral ground, the fancy coffee shop where she once proudly introduced me as the esthetician who makes a little extra. I needed to control the final narrative. I went not for peace, but for closure. Karen started with the classic narcissistic playbook, the non-apology apology. "Eliza, darling, we made mistakes. But your grandfather manipulated us into thinking you hated us. Now that the money thing is sorted, we can be a family again." Her eyes were dry. There was no mention of the $720,000, only vague references to misunderstandings. I didn't flinch. I let her perform. I saw her true self, raw and pathetic. The veneer of family quickly wore off. Karen's voice grew desperate. "The press is awful, Eliza. We need you to issue a statement. We need to save the business. We need access. You could always use more funds for that spa of yours, couldn't you?" It wasn't a request for love, it was a negotiation for reputation and future financial leverage. That was the true currency of our relationship. I realized she hadn't learned a thing. I looked at my mother, the woman who had traded my childhood for a monthly stipend, and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just peace. I didn't dignify her plea with a response. I didn't engage, argue, or justify. My silence was the most powerful answer I could give. It wasn't passive aggression, it was the ultimate, impenetrable boundary. She begged me to speak. I simply stood, placed enough cash on the table to cover both my coffee and hers, a small, final transactional statement, and turned to leave. Karen called my name, her voice cracking with real, desperate fear now, the fear of complete irrelevance. That fear was the only thing I ever truly wanted her to feel. I kept walking. The chapter was closed forever. The coffee was better than the company. My inheritance from Grandpa Vance wasn't just money, it was freedom. I invested a portion of it into expanding my spa business, turning my frivolous career into a massive success. The rest provided my grandmother with lifelong security. The irony? Karen and David lost their primary source of income, the $3,000 monthly payments, and were too disgraced to secure new clients. Their self-destruction was complete. The papers had a field day with the court transcripts. Karen and David's business was ruined by the public knowledge of their greed and lack of empathy. They had to sell their home to pay their legal fees. They became exactly what they feared most, irrelevant and poor. My revenge wasn't a sudden explosion, it was a slow, legal, and inevitable consequence of their own choices. Their toxic well ran dry. Grandpa Vance taught me that integrity is the most powerful weapon. He gave me the tools to build a life, and the means to finally cut ties with those who only saw me as an asset. My revenge wasn't about the money, it was about reclaiming my narrative and proving that love is never something you can purchase. I live happily now, free from their shadow, running my successful business with Grandma Helen often visiting. But what about you? Have you ever had to choose between a toxic family and your own peace? Let me know in the comments below. I often returned to the garden, the only place where the Vance's silence felt genuinely warm. Here, the finality of the court case truly sank in. The inheritance provided financial stability, but the real gift Grandpa Vance left me wasn't in the bank. It was the absolute, unshakable realization that my value was independent of my parents' approval or their wealth. This garden was my sanctuary. Grandpa Vance always said, "Justice is simply truth, recognized and codified." My revenge wasn't a malicious act, it was the inevitable triumph of truth over greed. By forcing Karen and David to publicly face their 20 years of neglect, the court didn't just uphold a will, it restored my dignity and validated my childhood narrative. That was the most profound form of justice imaginable. He taught me to fight with facts. The Vance's love was unconditional, practical, and enduring. They didn't just tell me they loved me, they showed me, through every missed birthday my parents overlooked, through every late-night essay review. My real inheritance was the knowledge that I was fiercely and fundamentally loved. That knowledge is the only true shield against the world's cynicism. Love is an action, not a word. Karen and David continued their slide into obscurity. Losing the legal battle, and the resulting financial and reputational ruin, meant their power over me was irrevocably finished. They couldn't hurt me anymore. They lost the ability to control my emotions, which was their ultimate weapon. My freedom came not from their defeat, but from my realization that I was strong enough to thrive without them. I am my grandfather's legacy. This story proves that family isn't about biology, it's about loyalty and integrity. What is the most important lesson your own family has ever taught you about true loyalty? I'm sitting in my new office, built with the inheritance I nearly lost. The irony isn't lost on me. My parents wanted this story to be about money and influence. But the truth is, it was about a simple, powerful distinction. I had to face them in court, not for the inheritance, but to defend the sanctity of the only real relationship I ever had. The one with Grandpa Vance. This is the final, crucial lesson. Their entire case rested on one premise, that I somehow manipulated an experienced, ethical judge. But they couldn't grasp the difference between their conditional, transactional approach and my unconditional devotion. I didn't manipulate him. I loved him. There's a difference. Manipulation is leveraged with guilt and threat. Love is simply offered, freely. That truth dismantled their entire lawsuit. They called the $3,000 monthly payments parental support. But the court defined them correctly, silence money. It was a fee to stay away, a transaction to absolve guilt. They confused financial obligation with emotional presence. They taught me that the opposite of love isn't hatred, it's indifference, monetized. My love was never on a ledger. My ultimate revenge wasn't the millions, though that certainly helps. It was the fact that my parents, who valued reputation above all else, had their moral bankruptcy exposed in the highest court. Their 20 years of calculated neglect became a permanent public record, certified by a judge. That humiliation, more than any monetary loss, was the final, devastating consequence of their greed. They became social pariahs. I now run my business, support my grandmother, and live completely outside the shadow of their toxic power. I took the tools my grandfather gave me, the estate, the legal knowledge, the integrity, and built a life where I am the author of my own peace. I chose dignity over drama. And truth over their manufactured reality. The true happy ending is freedom. Grandpa Vance's legacy was the ultimate shield. It allowed me to transform justified anger into structural freedom. So, I ask you, do you have people in your life who confuse attention with affection or money with love? How did you finally set your boundaries, and what was the moment you realized your self-worth was non-negotiable? The verdict was public, and the media had a field day. The tabloids, hungry for drama, didn't care about the facts of parental neglect. Their headlines screamed, "Gold digger granddaughter steals millions from parents." They ignored the bank ledgers, the missed birthdays, and the judge's ruling. I was instantly painted as a greedy, manipulative villain who took advantage of her frail, elderly grandfather. The narrative was twisted immediately. Talk show hosts and family experts had a great time dissecting my morals. She should give the money back as a gesture of goodwill, one pundit suggested, utterly blind to the 20 years of goodwill my parents never offered. They prioritized the easy, surface-level story, a daughter inheriting money, over the uncomfortable truth of calculated parental abandonment. It was painful, yet predictable. But then, the real people started talking. On social media and comment sections, there was a surge of support. People who understood the reality of toxic family dynamics came forward. She fought for her dignity, not just money, one comment read. Others shared their own stories of being betrayed by selfish relatives. It was a digital army defending the truth the court transcript had revealed. I found unexpected allies. Interestingly, Judge Miller never spoke publicly about the case. His silence, however, was deafening. The fact that a man of his standing upheld the will, knowing my parents' power, spoke volumes. His professional integrity provided the necessary shield against the media's emotional rhetoric. He ruled on law and fact, not on public opinion or sentiment. The law was on my side. While I was busy blocking out the noise, Karen and David were consumed by it. The media attention they initially courted as a weapon against me turned into a self-destructive force. Every story reiterated the court's finding: they chose money over their child. The public humiliation they craved for me was now entirely their own. Poetic justice in the digital age. For years, the name Coleman meant prestige and wealth. Now, it was synonymous with greed and abandonment. I quietly kept my business name, Eliza's Aesthetics, separate from the family name. My success wasn't built on inheritance, but on the principles of hard work and integrity Grandpa Vance modeled. I realized my brand was stronger than their old money reputation. Integrity is the best branding. I understood Grandpa Vance's final move completely. He knew the legal battle would be brutal, and he knew the media would be vicious. The will wasn't just a distribution of assets, it was his final testimony, his last act of character reference for me, a legally binding document stating who, in his eyes, was worthy of his name and love. His love was my armor. Karen and David's financial ruin was swift. The legal fees were enormous, and without the monthly silence money and the collapse of their reputation, their business failed. They were forced to sell their mansion, the one they often boasted about, at a severe loss. I didn't have to pursue them, their own greed created the final, perfect prison for them. Their debt was finally paid. Remember, when you choose to fight for the truth, the battle might be ugly, but the outcome is always worth it. The media will always distort, and toxic people will always project their own flaws. Your job is to focus on the facts and your integrity. Self-worth is the only inheritance that can never be legally contested. Focus on your own truth. I'm not just a revenge story, I'm a success story built on the rubble of betrayal. I took the negative energy and the unjust fight and channeled it into building a secure, happy life. I gave Grandma Helen the peace of mind she deserved, and I honored Grandpa Vance by living a life of integrity, something Karen and David could never comprehend. The whispers and the online trolls faded eventually because they couldn't stand against the truth of the court records. They wanted me to live a life dependent on them. Instead, they became dependent on my failure, and when that didn't materialize, they had nothing left. The silence I chose wasn't spiteful, it was self-preservation. It was the refusal to acknowledge their existence after they legally proved their unworthiness. That, my friends, is the most satisfying kind of win. Now, let's talk about your victories. What toxic relationships did you finally cut ties with? The day the tabloid headlines broke, I expected cancellations. Instead, my phone blew up with messages. Not from my parents' social circle, but from my true community, my loyal clients, my team, and my close friends. The bookings for the spa doubled overnight. It was a financial demonstration of loyalty that spoke louder than any of Karen's empty accusations. They didn't see a villain, they saw someone fighting for her life. The right people knew the truth. One of my oldest clients, Mrs. Henderson, came in just to give me a hug. "Eliza, your grandfather once told me you were the kindest soul he knew." We read the court transcripts. "The world can call you greedy, but we know you're just paying your dues to the people who truly raised you." Her affirmation meant more than any legal ruling. It was a complete validation of my character by people who truly knew me. This was my chosen family. My friends didn't ask questions, they brought coffee and showed up ready to work. They ran interference with the few prying reporters who tried to harass me at the spa. "We're a wall of integrity against the tabloids," my best friend, Chloe, declared. This was the unconditional support I had craved my entire life. They understood that the fight was personal, and they stood in the gap for me. My true allies protected me. I decided to use my platform, not to defend myself against my parents' lies, but to thank the people who stood by me. My post was simple: "Thank you for showing me that true family is built on loyalty, not blood. My grandfather taught me that, and you affirmed it." It shifted the public conversation away from the money and back to the core issue, the quality of our bonds. I controlled my own message. The best part? The exposure, intended to ruin me, became free advertising for my business. I opened a second, larger location named the Vance Wellness Center, in Grandpa's honor. I used the inheritance as the seed money to build the life Karen always dismissed as frivolous. My spa became a place of peace and support. The opposite of the Coleman legacy. Success is the sweetest revenge. My story shows that when you stand on integrity, your chosen family will find you. They will be the ones who truly heal you. So, think about your own life. Who are the 5 people in your life who embody true, unconditional loyalty? The ultimate revenge isn't seeing your enemies fail, it's building a life so beautiful, their failure becomes irrelevant. 6 months after the verdict, I stood outside my second, much larger spa location. The crowd was a sea of clients and friends. And above the door, in elegant gold script, was the new name, Helen Vance Aesthetics. It was more than a business, it was a memorial to true love. This was my true legacy. I had Grandma Helen cut the ribbon. Her hands, which had lovingly tended to me and my grandfather for decades, deserved the honor. She was glowing, knowing her role in my life was now immortalized alongside her husband's. She reminded me that the inheritance wasn't just mine. It was hers, too, securing her peace and confirming her husband's foresight. She deserved every moment of joy. I looked out at the crowd and remembered Karen's sneering comments about my frivolous job. This center, I announced, is dedicated to integrity and care, values I learned from the people whose names grace this building. They taught me that true wealth isn't inherited, it's created by bringing value to the world. And I promise to do that every single day. I turned their scorn into my strength. Contrast this joyous scene with the silence of the Coleman mansion. The family name that once symbolized status was now worthless. Karen and David were forced into an early, disgraced retirement, their names permanently etched in the court records as perjurers and negligent parents. They lost everything not because I took it, but because they tried to take what wasn't theirs. Their greed ate them alive. My ultimate final move? I established the Judge Vance Legacy Fund to support young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds. My parents thought I was motivated by greed. I proved them wrong by making sure the Vance name continued to support those in need. I used the money to create more opportunity, not to hoard it. The true winner uses power wisely. I looked at my new family, Grandma Helen, my loyal friends, the dedicated team at the spa. We took a group photo, a real family portrait, built on mutual respect and shared values. There was no conditional love, no fear of abandonment, only genuine affection. I realized that by losing my parents, I had gained a family far richer in every meaningful way. I am finally home. And that is how my story ends, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with quiet, profound success. I proved that the Coleman money and influence could not silence the truth, and could not break a bond built on genuine love. I transformed the toxic Coleman legacy into the supportive Vance legacy. I used the tools I was given to heal myself, honor my mentors, and help others. Karen and David were last seen moving into a modest condo, having spent their final years battling a daughter who simply walked away from their manipulation. They got exactly what they deserved, irrelevance. As for me, I got freedom. I got peace. I got a real family. If you've watched this entire saga, I hope you take this one lesson away: never let someone else define your worth, especially if they are the ones who failed to love you. The power to cut ties, to rebuild, to rename your life, that is the ultimate inheritance. It's non-taxable, non-transferable, and non-negotiable. It's all yours. After the fanfare of the opening and the fading headlines, there was one final, necessary visit. The noise of the court, the press, and my parents' greed had all dissolved. Here, by the graves of the only true family I ever knew, was where the real closure happened. The silence wasn't empty, it was filled with the memory of their warmth and wisdom. I came to offer my final, personal thank you. Peace was found here. I laid down the flowers, Grandpa Vance's favorite white roses, and looked at their names carved in the stone. They never needed titles or wealth to define them, they lived their truth every day. My parents tried to steal my future, my grandparents invested in my character. The difference was as stark as the cold stone and the warm sun on my face. The truest wealth is character. Then, I took out my new business card. It was engraved metal, simple but strong, featuring the logo for Helen Vance Aesthetics. And under my name, I had engraved 3 words, a final declaration to them and to the world: integrity wins. I laid the card on Grandpa Vance's stone. It wasn't a transaction, it was a permanent vow to carry their torch. The final word on the matter. We won, Grandpa, I whispered. Not just the money, but the argument. We proved that love is stronger than the law, and integrity is more powerful than any lie my parents could invent. Thank you for giving me the courage to fight, and the means to walk away forever. You didn't just leave me a legacy, you left me a blueprint for a life worth living. His spirit guided me always. I turned my back and walked away from that quiet place, knowing that the Coleman name no longer held any power over me. Their shame was their burden. My inheritance, both financial and moral, was my freedom. The legal win set me free physically, the moral victory set me free emotionally. The revenge story was over. The success story was just beginning. The true ending is my peace. People ask if I regret the fight. No. It wasn't about revenge, it was about defining reality. My grandfather forced the truth into the public record, allowing me to build a life where I am the hero, not the victim. Revenge isn't a dark act, sometimes it's just the courageous decision to live well, thrive, and leave the toxic past behind. This is the true power move. Karen and David continued to exist in their small, bitter world, defined by their failures. They never apologized, not genuinely. But I didn't need their apology. I needed their irrelevance. I built the Helen Vance aesthetics empire not to spite them, but to honor the only people who gave me real love. I used their greed to fuel my success. I took the millions they tried to steal and turned it into opportunity for others, and stability for Grandma Helen. The final, sweet victory is this: I don't think about them anymore. They are a closed file. I have moved on to a life of abundance, peace, and real, unconditional love. So, what does this mean for you, watching at home? It means that the greatest family revenge story isn't about destroying them. It's about building yourself. It's about finding your inner integrity and realizing that your life is your own masterpiece. What's the one toxic anchor you need to cut loose right now to start building your own empire of peace? Let me know in the comments. And remember, integrity always wins. Years passed, and the legacy of the Coleman drama finally gave way to the legacy of the Vance's love. My mission became clear, using my story and the Judge Vance Legacy Fund to help young women who, like me, had been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect them. I didn't want them to fight for revenge. I wanted them to fight for their financial and emotional freedom. I became the mentor I needed. I shared the hard truth with them: your family's dysfunction is not your destiny. The first step to winning is realizing you can walk away. My grandpa taught me to value integrity above all else. Integrity is your armor and your greatest asset. When you operate with truth, no manipulation, no matter how powerful, can touch you. I focused on self-worth. Many of these young women grew up with parents who confused money with love, just like mine. I told them, my parents tried to buy my silence. But silence costs your soul. You have the power to break the generational curse of emotional debt. Don't chase their love, chase your own peace. The resonance in that room was profound. A shared pain created a purpose. Mentorship wasn't just therapy, it was practical application. We worked on legal literacy, financial planning, and setting firm boundaries. I showed them how Grandpa Vance's foresight gave me the tangible tools to fight back. The inheritance wasn't a jackpot, it was strategic capital. I taught them how to legally and financially prepare for self-sufficiency, making sure they never needed the validation of a toxic family. Knowledge is the real power. Every session I lead is a quiet tribute to the man who saved me. Grandpa Vance's life was a testament to quiet, radical love. By funding new businesses and educational programs for these women, I ensure the Vance name is forever associated with healing, not family destruction. I took a destructive family fight and turned it into a constructive generational movement. His integrity lives through us. The greatest outcome of my revenge was the ability to help others find their voice and their escape. It proved that your trauma can become your greatest strength. So, for those of you healing out there, what skill or lesson from your own difficult journey are you ready to use to help empower someone else? If my family revenge story proves one thing, it's this fundamental truth that transcends law, money, and DNA. The people who abandoned me were blood. The people who loved me, saved me, and invested in my future, Grandpa Vance, Grandma Helen, my friends, were chosen. Remember this: family isn't DNA. It's who shows up. Choose your people wisely. If this story resonated with you, like and subscribe. More importantly, tell me in the comments, who is your show up family, and how did they save you? Integrity wins. If you take away anything from my family revenge saga, remember these 5 life lessons. First, gratitude. Be relentlessly grateful for the show-up people in your life. My Grandpa Vance saved me. Second, boundaries. Toxic people don't respect kindness, they exploit it. I had to enforce legal boundaries to regain my peace. Your peace is non-negotiable. Third is self-worth. When my parents called me greedy, I chose to believe my value, not their lies. Your self-worth is the only inheritance that can't be contested. Fourth, truth. The court records proved the truth, silencing the tabloids. And finally, fifth, legacy. Your legacy isn't the money you hoard, it's the good you do with it. Build a positive legacy today.